The passing of Yerkes left a considerable gap in the former district line's management. Yerkes had renamed the company to the Underground Electric Railway Company of London, or UERL for short, in a celebration from the move from steam. The new UERL had to fill the void and see off declining profits, so the new chairman, Sir George Gibb, decided to hire not one, but two men. Albert Stanley and Frank Pick would forever be known as the formidable pair. Albert was a British-born American immigrant who had begun his railway career at the age of 14, working on the Detroit Tramway as a messenger boy, and then worked through to foreman. The higher-ups, noticing his management and administrative skills, promoted him to the ranks of divisional superintendent. He was so good that by the time he was 20 years old, he had risen to become the railway's controller. In 1907, Albert was offered the UERL management post, offering a lucrative salary of £2,000 per year, our equivalent of £2 million today. Although this was good money, and Albert snapped up the chance, he soon came to regret the move due to the railway's financial state. Albert was partnered with Frank Pick. Frank was a personal assistant to Sir George Gibb and had worked on the North Eastern Railway. He had qualified as a lawyer in the University of London, but Frank wasn't interested in pursuing a law career, so he went to work with the railways instead. Both Pick and Stanley went through the UERL's inner workings with a fine-tooth comb and made sweeping changes to the internal operating procedures. Working with a designer called Walter Gott, they introduced new maps and a new joint booking and coordinated fare system that intersected with all the Underground Railway companies, even with the dreaded Metropolitan lines. One of the most noticeable changes were to the posters and public literature. Stanley and Pick designed a new advertisement policy. The passengers had complaints that due to the prolific advertisements, the name of the station would be hard to read and many missed their stops. The policy limited the number, the size and the location of the posters. This massively improved the station's look, and Pick insisted that the station's name should be surrounded by two red half-moon shapes above and below the name to distinguish it. If the station had darker walls, the half-moon red shape would be surrounded by a white border. Within 6 years, all of the UERL stations had adopted this new design. By 1910, bit by bit, and through sheer guidance and determination, the UERL finally gained profitability again. Pick and Stanley marked the three separate UERL lines into one, rebranding them as the London Electric Company. By then, George Gibb had stepped down to pursue a role in politics, and at the age of just 35, Albert Stanley picked up the reins as chairman, making him one of the youngest chairmen in the railway's history. Albert and Frank began a quest to swallow any rivals whole and quickly began to snap up as many companies as they could. This did not just include railways. Tramways and bus companies were devoured by the LER. Soon, significant companies were slipping into the LER's net, including the City and South London Underground Network and the Central London Company. The LER did miss out on the City and Great Northern, which the Metropolitan snapped up and added to its own. The LER approached the Metropolitan on many occasions to merge into one, but the Metropolitan, seeing itself as the first and premier service, refused entirely and will continue to refuse right up until 1933. The Metropolitan themselves were not happy with the LER takeovers. Buses, which would independently feed passengers to their stations, were now feeding passengers to LER routes. Trams were stopping away from their stations, and the new electric trains were a huge hit. The Metropolitan introduced new electrified engines which were lighter, but many customers would say they were as charming as a brick. The Metropolitan, taking a leaf out of Pick's book, also redesigned their station's nameplates, but used a diamond background instead of circular. They say imitation was the sincerest form of flattery, and I can only assume Pick was not thrilled when he heard what the Metropolitan had done. The Metropolitan also wanted to focus on style and uniqueness, so they introduced 2 buffet cars from the Pullman Company with a 10-year exclusive lease to offer dining service to its passengers. The 2 carriages were named Mayflower and Galatea and were painted in the Pullman brown and offered a ton of luxury. It seems strange that coaches which you would expect on the Orient Express being pulled on the London Underground service. But it was a very unusual and a unique way of raising revenue, as well as getting a very strange driving experience. Meanwhile, in Europe, an Archduke's assassination would catapult the world into war. England declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914 after Germany threatened to invade Belgium, while a French defeat would have left Germany in charge of most of Europe. On the underground, people scrambled to the city to work on war contracts. Troops were being moved along lines and were interchanging with the Metropolitan's broad gauge tracks. As the war moved from the trenches to the air, the underground became a source of shelter for those living within the city. It wasn't popular. The underground was stuffy and uncomfortable, but it was much safer than being overground with the Zeppelins overhead. The underground also saw a gender shift within its workforce. Before the war, the predominant employees that worked on the network were men, but due to the shortage of men, women stepped up to these roles. Female drivers, guards, gate people and station masters were soon in abundance. In 1915, the new Merida Vale station opened with an all-female team. It was a world first for gender equality and a massive boost for the suffragette movement, who have been campaigning for votes and equality for women since 1903. Once the war was over, the Metropolitan Railway paid special homage to its fallen employees in a special memorial which can still be seen at Baker Street today. Merida Vale would also be the last station to feature Frank Pick's bullseye half-moon design. He had begun to tinker to the existing logo before the war, before both he and Albert stepped aside to help with the war effort. Edward Johnson was commissioned to design a new font for the new logo for the network, and in 1919, the new and world-famous roundel logo that we all know and love was born. The war spurred on many different advancements in technology and design. Some were used in the war effort itself, but after the war, these advancements spilled into civilian life. Sadly, these advancements would mean that many jobs that were done by men were now redundant. One example is the infamous gateman. During the war, air-operated automatic doors were developed specifically to allow troops to evacuate confined rooms and vehicles quickly, negating the need for the gateman. Having seen these work in many buildings, Frank Pick decided to put these on his carriages throughout his network. This meant that instead of a 2-guard, 2-driver and 4-gateman train, the train could be run with just 2 guards and a single driver. With more and more women also gaining vital skills working on the railway, some simply didn't want to go back to their former lives. Because of the lack of gender equality legislation, the union stepped in, and the companies forced the women to leave with only a photo and a certificate showing their thanks. It was considered improper for women to work in transport roles, but the 1919 Sex Disqualification Removal Act gave the women the right to work in certain professions that some considered more suited. These included punch girls, which would punch tickets, or they would work in offices or in telephone exchanges. Despite the women forcing to give up their work for the men, many men returning from war expecting jobs to go back to were shocked to find they were now redundant. In 1919, just 1 year after the war ended, the Underground Network experienced its first strike. Unions, furious with the removal of the gatemen, refused to let the trains pass unless jobs were guaranteed. To keep the unions happy, gatemen were kept on as staff, but were now porters. This led to a surplus of staff at stations, and this was very short-lived as the railways eventually would make them redundant anyway and changed the policy in 1931 following the UK financial crisis. The government, concerned with the vast amount of unemployment, gave the railways an unexpected windfall. They created a new job creation scheme which would allow large businesses to borrow money for large projects provided they could guarantee it would generate new jobs. Pick took full advantage of the scheme, and Albert Stanley, who had been awarded with a baronetcy and would now be known as Lord Ashfield, strived to improve the entire network. Tunnels that were not in line with the standard LER diameter were widened. 22,000 tunnel rings supporting the tunnels were replaced, new junctions were added, and some were replaced completely. Lord Ashfield was thankful but worried. Even though he and Pick have returned some profitability to the company, it simply wasn't enough to pay the investment back. He could only hope that these improvements would entice the populace to return. Following a successful facelift of many of the overground stations to a newer and more sleeker design, Pick and Lord Ashfield turned their attention once again to the rolling stock. As with many engines and designs of the era, the new stock was streamlined. Done with a cumbersome strange engine at the front and was replaced with a neat cab and large windows. The pneumatic doors were replaced centrally within the carriage, and the cars were painted in a rich vermilion with the iconic underground motif. They were the most successful stock on the railway, with some going on to the Isle of Wight upon their retirement, and the last car being retired entirely in 2020, over 80 years after its construction. So next time we look at the LER's movement south, the surface developments, and we also go back to the Metropolitan line and just see what the Premier Service has been up to and witness its final grips on power as its own independent line.